thank you to both to you, Lata, and to you, Pearl and Veena, for your presentations. And I'll now get underway by asking one of the first questions that has popped up in the Q&A, and it's around work with schools. So the question that comes from Rochelle Coe is, how can we support schools to in turn support young people who might have experienced sexual assault and rape? So perhaps if I could throw this to you first, Lata, and then we might also hear from Pearl and Veena.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for the question, but also thank you so much, Veena and Pearl, for sharing Asha's story and how you all worked with her. It was just such a beautiful representation of people working in a culturally informed way. So thank you very much for that. In relation to working with young people in schools, and I imagine, so was the question, Lachlan, just to clarify, specifically in relation to refugee young children who are in schools, or just in general amongst school-age children?
It doesn't specify, so it is about working with schools. I suspect it is probably really focused on the experiences of young people from refugee backgrounds who've experienced sexual assault and rape.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for that. And I think for them, again, we also have to look at what might be happening in their families. So, for example, have the adults in their family also experienced sexual assault? Or indeed, have the adults in the family been the offenders of the child's sexual assault? So this is where we have to understand that it could happen in a whole range of ways in terms of who the offenders could be. So firstly, to understand that, but then the fear for the young people to actually report it, because again, of the repercussions we know through research. And even though when children are aware in schools of the counselor being available, they seem to want to protect the one family member who is protecting them. So let's take, for example, it is the mother or a female caregiver who is protecting them. They are afraid that if they reported the violence to the school counselor, that indeed that person might face repercussions. That's the adult. Or that they might be removed from their family. So we need to understand that even with relation to in relation to children, they are not ready to seek formal assistance. So how can we still work with them in a trauma, violence, and culturally informed way when they might not report it? This is where absolutely the trusted teachers and other people in the school might be able to play a great role. We know there is work going on there in relation to that, where if the teachers openly talk about this, that, you know, it is okay, again, it is no fault of their own and it's okay to seek help, but also to focus on the lack of negative repercussions. That's when children will more readily be able to open up to the trusted adult. So to create that sense of trust, first of all, in schools, and then to ensure that any program in schools, such as the Respectful Relationships program and others that are currently being run, that they also have a cultural focus. Any program that's developed needs to ensure that it's been co-designed with people from diverse backgrounds, with diverse experiences, with people with lived experience, including young children and young adults, and then be implemented anyway.
Thank you. Well, Veena, there's some comments you might make in relation to this?
Yeah, we agree with what Lata is saying. You know, building safety and trust is so important. And, you know, if and when the young person discloses, I think, you know, having programs that are culturally sensitive, you know, go a long way, but also factor in how difficult it is for a child to disclose. You know, and often, probably it's not always necessary for them to be able to talk about, or, you know, it may not even be possible for them to disclose details of what, you know, they have gone through and what they have endured. and to be willing to deal with that uncertainty. But I think it is important to be able to identify markers which indicate that the client, that the child or young person has actually experienced, this horrific experience, and build relationships, because trust is broken, and being able to trust an adult or anyone else around them is very difficult. So moving along those kind of parameters, to kind of help them move forward and beyond, and be ready for disclosure if and when it occurs.
Okay, thank you. Another question that's come from, it's an anonymous question. And this is, I think, directed towards to Veena and Pearl. Did you find it necessary to explore with Asha the origin of the voices, the origin or function of the voices, or was it clear for her that saying no to them was her process of healing?
Initially, Asha was not willing to talk about her sexual assault. And as she began to talk about the voices, it is through the voices that the disclosure happened. It was true. So it was very clearly associated with the perpetrators and with those who had actually attacked her home. There were groups of people who had attacked her home, and it was their voices that she could hear. So, we were quite clear about the origin of the voices. And, in a way, that was something that Asha brought to us herself. We did not explore, because with a client who's as vulnerable and as shut down as Asha was, it's not easy to get them to talk about, what they have endured, because you could lose the client or she could spiral further downwards. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. Perhaps ask another question, possibly again direct this to you, Lata, in the first instance. Are human rights approaches such as Shark Cage culturally appropriate for migrant and refugee women? How do we make human rights education culturally appropriate?
Thank you, Lachlan. And I responded to that actually in the chat, because I wasn't aware it was in the Q&A and it was asked in the chat. But to repeat my response there, I understand that the Shark Cage approach has been developed using a human rights approach. I would just ask people to consider different points. Firstly, the naming of any program or approach. Shark Cage might feel like a sense of entrapment for people, and they might not really be aware before they start engaging with the program as to what it's about. So people might want to engage in a more freeing symbolism. And so perhaps just consider the name of any program that one develops to ensure that it is culturally suitable as well. But then in terms of the program itself, for any program, so this might be either whether it's the Shark Cage program or any other program that anyone's developing, we need to know whether it's an evidence-based approach that people are adopting, first of all, and then when it was being developed, who was involved in the co-design of that approach? Were people involved from culturally diverse backgrounds? If they weren't, and if it is being implemented across different communities, how relevant is that program for different people? Because if their voice has not been input into the development of that program itself. We also need to ensure that there's ongoing evaluation of that. So again, to provide that program for different communities, if it is being done so, and to seek their feedback if it is working for them. So for any program and framework, there needs to be an ongoing evaluation, because it's only through evidence that we'll know the effectiveness of any program. So again, if we want to ensure that the Shark Cage program or any other such program is culturally relevant, we need to give it and ask feedback from those diverse communities to see if it's working for them.
Thank you. We have another question that I'll direct to Pearl and Veena. It's about the question of voices that's come up again. Sometimes clients are hearing voices telling them to end their lives and to end their suffering and pain. How would we address this in a counselling setting?
It's always challenging when clients, report to you that they are hearing voices, because voice hearing is so complex and it's not well understood. And I think it's important to understand, what the voice is about, whether the client is kind of, for example, hearing their own voice, or whether the voice is really a reflection. It's a kind of a projective identification in a way. So it's important to kind of, in some ways, not be alarmed by it, because it happens in many cultures. It happens quite, it is all on a continuum. And to understand it from that perspective, just because you hear a voice doesn't make you psychotic, but to kind of, in a way, befriend it and understand it better, and almost enter a dialogue with it if possible. But it's important to kind of not see it as an isolated symptom, but in context of what else the client is presenting you with. Because there are many other kind of identifiers or many other cues that the client can give you, which really would be able for you to use your clinical judgment and to make a decision about what this voice is all about. There is no need to kind of jump to the conclusion that, oh yes, the client has reported a voice, so I need to now refer him onwards for medication or for psychiatric intervention or another type of intervention before exploring exactly what it is about.
Great, thanks, Pearl. And that question was from Basma Al-Rubai. Another question that's come, which is from an anonymous participant. Are there any insights on how to respond to domestic and family violence and sexual violence when the service works with both victims and perpetrators, and sometimes children? I'd be interested in hearing how to safely support the victim, a stroke survivor, and still provide counselling to the person who was responsible for the violence, but keeping accountability in mind too, and issues of the risk of collusion. So some comments that you might have, perhaps Lata, on that, and then we might hear also from Pearl and Veena.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I've been engaged in such discussions with different practitioners here in Victoria, and we're also doing research. It is a challenging one, especially if the service is providing the service for everyone involved in the family. I think we need to ensure, first of all, the safety of the victim survivor. So is the victim survivor safe in an environment where she might, and I say she because of the majority of statistics that we know that affect women, would the survivor feel safe knowing that the perpetrator might also be attending that service? We need to question that first of all, and we need to ask her, if we're not sure, if she wants it to happen, that he receive counseling as well from that service, then I guess, by all means, to proceed with that, but also to not begin with, let's say, couples counseling as a first off. You need to individually understand, and perhaps different counselors actually work with the perpetrator and the victim survivor. Because in spite of our principles and our ethical guidelines that we might follow, we will have the knowledge of what is happening. And implicitly, we might be making a judgment then if we're working with both the perpetrator and the victim survivor. So in spite of us drawing boundaries, we might actually not be able to do that very well. So this is where we need to ensure her safety at all times, the child's safety at all times as well. See what they need and what they want before proceeding with engaging with the perpetrator. Otherwise, if the woman does not feel safe, then it would be best practice to actually refer the perpetrator to another service.
Thank you. Thanks, Lata. Pearl and Veena, any comments you have in relation to this particular question?
couldn't agree with you more, Lata. It's important to create a safe internal space, and that's what counseling is all about. And if that internal space is also threatened, it's very hard to have a therapeutic relationship or create that environment for the woman or the man. Yeah.
And I think just one more thing I'd like to say, I'm not a counsellor, but safety is first and foremost. But at the same time, I think as practitioners, we have big hearts, and compassion for both is necessary for any kind of healing to happen.
I mean, I just would make one comment myself on this as well. I think it does throw up a lot of very significant dilemmas and challenges when services are attempting to work in with both with people who are survivors, victims, and perpetrators. Having said that, I think it's also very important that there are services that are offered to perpetrators, and a lot of what we need to do around the whole issue of domestic family violence is work with men about their behaviour and attitudes. So that's really crucially important in all of this. Those men, obviously, that are either at risk of behaving in in those ways, or that have a history of doing that. Can we perhaps move on and just ask a further question? It's a longish question. I think it might be the last one that we'll actually have time for. It's actually linked to, in some ways, to what we've just discussed. And to you, I think, Lata, in the first instance, do you do any work with men in relation to sexual assault in their families on how they can respond and how they can support their partner in terms of challenging some of those cultural values of honour and ownership that often pervade this space? Working with survivors of genocide, men are often felt overwhelmed with guilt and shame for not being able to protect their family members. So some comments from you, Lata, and then also from Pearl and Veena on this.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. In my personal practitioner-related experience, I have only worked with men who use violence when the victim survivor has actually wanted me to. Otherwise, I have not done so. And so I do mainly work with victim survivors in my practice, and that includes children and women. But we have done research in relation to this in terms of the pre-existing factors that might make migrant and refugee men prone to perpetration of domestic and family and sexual violence. So that's what we examined. So what are the pre-existing factors before their migration or upon migration? And what we found was that their prior experiences, because the person who asked the question mentioned genocide and other things that they would have gone through. So absolutely, the political situation in the countries of origin, their prior experiences, and especially the one standout factor in all of the studies that we reviewed was childhood sexual abuse, especially. So if the men have gone through childhood sexual abuse, they are more likely to perpetrate. So we need to understand as well as to what are the risk factors for men who might be perpetrating, and then try and work with those factors.
Great, thank you, Lata. And Veena and Pearl, any comments you'd like to make in relation to that question?
If I understood the question correctly, it's about the guilt that men feel when they learn that they have not been able to protect, their partners or others in, basically women or young children. There aren't many who will come out and talk to you about that openly to begin with. When we did work with men who had survived sexual assault and who had been raped, we ran another project called Mantra, which stands for Man, Trauma and Rape. Quite a few men towards the end of our intervention would share their guilt about, not being able to protect other women who were, members of their families, but also who were held, as captives and who were incarcerated and tortured along with them. And in fact, once they are able to process their own trauma and their own experiences, they're able to talk about it more openly. In fact, that is what actually led to our group, because we were urged by the men who had survived and who had gone through the intervention to set up something similar, for the women who have also experienced, significant sexual assault. So the second group, in fact, the one that Lachlan mentioned at the start, was a result of, the men acknowledging that, look, there are, women who are also, kind of victims of systemic rape. So I guess it's a much under-researched topic, and Latha, I hope you and your colleagues are able to fill us with a lot more information and and carry this forward. But it's a very interesting question. Thank you for mentioning that, Mr. Anonymous or Miss Anonymous.
Okay, so look, I will draw our question and answer session to a close there. Thank you, Latha and Pearl and Veena, for answering those questions. There's a couple more things I will say just before we finish up. Just a thank you to the speakers. So not only for their participation in the Q&A session, but also the wonderful presentations that you both made. Really appreciate that. And I want to thank also the audience members for the questions you've asked. And just to note that we've had people participating from various parts of Australia, and we also have one of our colleagues from Ukraine who's participating in this session today. So people from all over the place, and we're really thankful for your interest in this. We've had around 280 people online as the presentations were taking place. So the final thing for me to say is that our next clinical masterclass, if you've enjoyed this one, then please join us for the third clinical masterclass that will take place on the 24th of July. And the topic of that clinical masterclass will be mechanisms underpinning maintenance of PTSD, how culture influences the case formulation and treatment of trauma. And the external presenter on that occasion will be Associate Professor Dr. Laura Jobson, and we'll also hear from Jeanette Ninnis, who's a staff member at START. So we look forward to you all joining us next on the 24th of July, and I want to thank everyone for their participation today and wish you all a very pleasant evening. Goodbye.